Hi, this is Robert of MayflowerBookshop.com, Mayflower Bookshop in Berkeley, Michigan. Today I'd like to go into Iron Hans. Iron John is another name for this. And I'm taking it from the Complete Grimm's Fairy Tales book that I love. There's a lot of different versions, but this was one that I liked because I got to know a little bit Joseph Campbell, and he writes a folklorist commentary, and the introductions by Pedrick Colum. And I met I was giving a talk at the World Symposium in Toronto, and got to hang out with Misha Kushi and a friend of mine that I had met earlier, Robert Bly. And over the years, I had really given Bly like a lot of my raps about Rudolf Steiner and Tibetan Buddhism. And I think that he had like kind of funny taste in his mouth from the Tibetan Buddhist experience he had with Chogyam Trungpa and another friend of mine, Chogyam Trungpa, and Allen Ginsberg. And they had some kind of falling out. I don't want to get into all that now, but I'm just saying that I used to interpret Robert Bly's dreams, and, I was given scholarships, secret scholarships to hang out at the men's club meeting, with James Hillman, Michael Mead, Robert Moore, who I would debate and disagree with, thinking that he was a little tough on the goddess and the feminine wisdom, Sophia. But I tried to comprehend it all, and these are really powerfully good people. Well, Campbell, of course, I tried to, deepen the Tibetan Buddhist thing because I was hanging out with Tibetan lamas, a lot of them. And the Dalai Lama had really helped me hanging out with him to appreciate all the other lamas and not be terrified by, let's say, Trungpa's clairvoyance and insights, and that I could hold my own there. I was kind of brought up through Theosophy and was introduced to Rudolf Steiner when I had discovered a secret library beneath a library at a major Theosophical Society organization building. And through the years, I have studied Tibetan Buddhism and, Theosophy, Tibetan Buddhism, Rudolf Steiner, and Manly Haw, Osho, Neoplatonism, Hermetics. And I really grew to love fairy tales and Sherlock Holmes even as a little child. So I really heavily turned Bly onto, against his will almost, Rudolf Steiner. And we had a falling out when I interpreted a dream. That would be a fun story to share with you. I interpreted a dream of Robert, and I was friends with Marianne Woodman. Robert Bly was a really good friend of Marianne Woodman, probably much more than I was, but she took a liking to me, and we had like an interesting rapport, and she bought a lot of books from me in the Mayflower Bookshop, and told Robert Bly that she thought I was like a pure form of puer aeternus, that she hadn't met somebody quite like that since himself. And so I had a very peculiar relationship with everybody, more or less. And somehow I managed to keep going on, and I'm still here on the planet Earth pondering these significant holy encounters with these spiritual thinkers, and beings, and feeling willful activities of this grace that, I don't even have the right words for, when you get older or more mature, you start to realize what people you had met that significantly altered your life or presented a holy altar of the heart that one could go around and visit. And, there are certain people in your life that the more you think about it, the more wisdom you get out of it. anyway, my point is that I always thought that I had really thrown Rudolf Steiner hard at Robert Bly. And then I didn't see him for a couple of years. He told me he was like studying and hanging out with not Tibetan Buddhists, Rudolf Steiner anthroposophists, especially in Southern California, I think. And then he came up with this Iron John book and came really big on this Iron Hans, Iron John story, which I had a slightly different take on. And so I thought I should maybe share my take, because I had kind of a falling out with Robert Moore with my critique of his wonderful book, but it's, I think, one-sided. The King, the Warrior, Magician, and Lover. You can see these are hard things to talk about and probably need a panel, a panel discussion and, public thing, because it would be more fun. But these are serious topics. And one of the topics that I want to take on today, and I might take a couple talks, is Iron Hans, Iron John, which Robert Bly wrote a book about men's work and maturing and individuality and finding your wild man and finding the gold. And I think that fairy tales have like several interpretations, and each one of us will have our own unique view of that. Each one of us must come on our own, of our free will and accord, of the necessity of ourself in the world to find peace and harmony and happiness and joy and freedom, enlightenment. To a large extent, freedom or enlightenment is insight and the creative capacity to art ourselves and the world around us and beautify and make things good, make good of things. Be true to ourselves and what we discover in each other. And that harmony of spirit, creative soul, freedom, joy, happiness, interaction, participatoriness, the harmonies and the songs that come and the gardens that come from even an open-hearted, honest search for truth, even if we don't find it, will bring about a greater sense of things and a greater value to life and a happiness that transcends suffering and misunderstandings. So I want to get into, like, the fairy tales were always thought of as being dropouts of the mystery schools and a common populace fantasy or fancy of some kind of moral story. And I think fairy tales and games and myths that survive through time represent some kind of more eternal truth and passage of maturity for human beings. It's not just about being a man and a woman. It's about being a fully participant, active ingredient, alchemical transformative ingredient to what's going on in the world. So I'm getting lost with my little philosophy here. Philosophy meaning love of truth or love of wisdom. And the complete Grimm's fairy tales, I have the story of Iron Hans. Let's see how far we can get before I have to jump to another mission. So, it's interesting that this fairy tale begins, there's a lot of threes, you'll notice. And one can take a look at this as in anthroposophical or theosophical terms, that there's 7 earths and 7 levels of consciousness. One can see the beginning where once upon a time a king who had a forest near his palace full of all kinds of wild animals One day he sent out a huntsman to shoot him a roe, but he did not come back. Perhaps some accident had befallen him, said the king. And the next day he sent out 2 more huntsmen who were to search for him, but they too stayed away. Then on the 3rd day he sent all his huntsmen and said, "Scour the whole forest through, and do not give up until you have found all 3. But of these also none came home again. And of the pack of hounds which they had taken with them, none were seen again. From that time forth," sent out 3 sets, but now it's this time forth. No one would any longer venture into the forest, and it lay there in deep stillness and solitude, and nothing was seen of it, but sometimes an eagle or a hawk flying over it. This lasted for many years, when an unknown huntsman announced himself to the king as seeking a situation and offered to go into the dangerous forest. Now, right off the bat, it's hard to keep up with myth, especially the Greek and Egyptian myths and fairy tales, and the fairy tales here, because there's a lot of spiritual truth. Right off the bat, the king is going into the forest, and again, I'm just going to jump into my view of a way of interpreting. So that sending out a huntsman, sending out 2, sending out all the rest of them, and this is like our higher self incarnating. And the physical, emotional, and mental. We incarnate, but we don't come back with the real gold. We don't come back with enlightenment. We tried to hunt a wild thing of the physical world, maybe, an emotion, but it wasn't enlightenment. And and there's no return. In other words, we can't really fully incarnate in the physical body. We're having trouble, our higher self. And at best, we have an ego, like ego or eagle. We have an ego that's flying around, trying to get inside. And then we have a hawk that's hawking for something, selling something or wanting to buy something, to get something. And so we have this highfalutin sense of everybody has an opinion and a judgment of everything, and what's going on in the world. And we can't really capture anything for real that has lasting value, and we're just flying over it. From that time forth, on the 4th level of the the first earth is Saturn evolution, and then sun, and then moon. And then when it comes to the earth evolution we're on, that has 7 steps to it, nobody can fully incarnate their higher self. No one would any longer really venture into the forest. And it lay there in deep stillness and solitude, that only in our stillness and solitude, our aloneness at one-minute meditation, can we find a creative nothing. And it says right here, it lay in deep stillness and solitude, and nothing was seen of it. We couldn't really understand the nothing as something. The emptiness practice, the right perception and view of emptiness. No permanent self, that everything is kind of related. This is a Tibetan kind of way of looking at it. But sometimes an eagle or a hawk is flying over it. This lasted for many years, till an unknown huntsman, in other words, a selfless hunter. Like the hunter is a desire. I might desire money or a car or love. You could desire a lot of things, inward and outward, until you're ready to announce that you're here for everybody's sake and you're wishing for enlightenment. The unknown friend, the huntsman, announces himself to the king as seeking a certain kind of situation in the chess game here that transcends the black and white squares, right? Consciousness rises. and offered to go into the dangerous forest. The meaning of life, right? The king, however, would not give his consent and said, "It is not safe in there. I fear it would fare you no better than with the others, and you'd never come out again." The huntsman replied, "Lord, I will venture it at my own risk. Of fear, I know nothing." See, back then, the king or the head would be like the Lord, representing the Father. Our Father who art in heaven is our Father. Everybody shares this oneness at one minute. The Father principle of Saturn evolution. We share that. And some of us share the sun that we find in ourselves and each other. And some of us share that third step of the astral worlds. The sun inside of each other is like the Christos or Hermes. The astro is the wild animal side of it, right? Taming the desire body and the fears. It says, the huntsman replied, "Lord, I will venture at my own risk. Of fear, I know nothing." So of fear, the emptiness practice and the nothingness practice, the nothingness that Gurdjieff says we are. The emptiness that the Tibetans talk about as the origin of Vajrayana. Like the everything and nothing creates this tension of opposites that can create consciousness. Are you following me? The huntsman therefore, back to the story, the huntsman therefore betook himself with his dog to the forest. The dog represents the lower mind that's obedient to the true hunter. The true hunter, right? The true spiritual warrior is Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. And again, Trungpa talks a lot about this, the Shambhala rainbow warrior. The huntsman therefore betook himself with his dog to the forest. It was not long before the dog fell in with some game on the way and wanted to pursue it. But hardly had the dog run 2 steps when it stood before a deep pool. Could go no farther. A naked arm stretched itself out of the water, seized it and drew it under. This is quite different than the Lady of the Lake offering Arthur with Merlin behind him in a boat on the lake, and the Lady of the Lake offers him the sword, right? This is completely different. You don't just get to be king here. This is going to take a little while. Hope you're ready. And so this arm reaches out and and seizes the dog and pulls it under. In other words, the emotions or the sea of samsara, the sea of the possibility of nirvana, sucks one in, the lower mind. The huntsman saw that. He went back and fetched 3 men to come with buckets and bail out the water. So this is like a positive thinking, feeling, willing, the 3 men, or is it the idea of the Trinity that comes and helps him? He invokes his higher Trinity, and he empties the water. In other words, you have to not take things personally for a while until you can see what's going on. When they could see to the bottom, there lay a wild man whose body was brown like rusty iron. Ah, the red earth. Okay. And whose hair hung over his face down to his knees. This is a real hippie. They bound him with cords and led him away to the castle. So it seems like the wild man doesn't have much power when you get rid of the emotions. So at first you have to separate the subtle from the gross in alchemy. And here's a place where we are practicing emptiness, and and we can see more clearly what our desire is and our untamed self, passion, rather than compassion. So there was a great astonishment over the wild man as they brought him back, and the king, however, had put him in an iron cage. They didn't know what to do with him, so the king puts him in an iron cage. It's kind of like Hercules drags the 3-headed dragon, the 3-headed dog, Cerberus, from the underworld as one of his tasks. And he brings him up to the heaven realms, and Zeus goes, "Get him out of here and bring him back to the underworld." So you can't really bring the materialistic thinking, physical, emotional, mental, up to the heaven realm. You have to develop spiritual thinking, feeling, and willing to bring that down into the denser worlds, and that's where Ulysses develops, or Odysseus develops cunning in the war of Troy in the Iliad, and then eventually to get back home takes more than cunning. We have to eventually encounter the divine feminine in her many disguises. And I think the men's club often missed that part of it. But we're going to get to that. And we all have a right to our interpretation. And fairy tales and myths are only as good as you can make them work in the modern world. And you can see how dangerous spirituality is when people just quote and use it as authority, like aromanically, or they use the quotes as a Luciferic idealism that has no practical grounding, whereas the practicality of like just quoting is good for like kids, you know, when you're learning you got to repeat, but adults repeating can kill your creativity. Okay, I'm getting a little crazy here, aren't I? So unless you've done your homework and read this whole fairy tale through, and you've read at Blavatsky's Key to Theosophy, and you've read at Gelek Rinpoche or Trungpa or Gyatso's, you read the Tibetan Buddhist literature on wisdom and compassion, uniting that in your heart. Unless you've read at Rudolf Steiner and Blavatsky and Steiner's idea of the seven earths, and you know, it gets tricky right here where we are in the story. But follow me anyway, because you'll get what you need to get, and then we can come back on it later. So there was a great astonishment over the wild man. The king, however, had him put in an iron cage in his courtyard. So we're in the Iron Age, and our spiritual passion and the wildness of our Atma, our pure spirit, is caged in the blood. The reincarnating ego comes through the red blood that is deep beneath the passionate waters of samsara. So there's a transcendental wisdom over your head, but there's also a deep gold spark of flaming love truth from the sun that's buried within our deepest heart, at core, right? Ask Inanna, ask Persephone, ask Artemis. There's a few wise women in the room. So the king had the wild man, rusty red, put in an iron cage in his courtyard. In other words, the courtyard's the thinking. The thinking's over-controlling. And forbade the door to be opened on pain of death. And the queen herself was to take the key in her keeping. And from this time forth, everyone could go into the forest with safety. So my good old friend Robert Bly, he was a good friend because we would share a lot of ideas and even contest each other, but keep each other as friend. Robert Bly said that this is where the mother keeps the key to the sons. The son has to get the key back from the mother of his passion and his world work, and the key that opens the door to the higher kingdoms as well as the garden, and that the mother's hiding it. That's how Bly interpreted it, and there's a certain truth to that, but it's really not just your mother. It's the queen of the world, that we have to get to where the wisdom, Sophia, is sleeping within us, on Rudolf Steiner's interesting, weird symbolism. At least at this moment, I'm calling it that. He has it that Lucifer has, in his myth reality, Lucifer has stolen Sophia, kidnapped her, and that she's like sleeping in space. And we're gifted, we've been like left with, not gifted, we've been left with tons of data and knowledge as a booby prize. And, you know, computers and alien intelligence and artificial intelligence, and not artful, but superficial. And that it's meaningless after a while. That knowledge becomes meaningless when we're dying. The earth is dying, right? So we could take this in a lot of directions, but the queen has the key in her safekeeping about the wild man. And so that is a dilemma that we're faced with, is how do we get back that key and what is the key to the divine Sophia, and then and then it goes on. The story goes on to a king had a son of 8 years, and 8 is a symbol of the higher octave of music. And he was playing in the courtyard, and while he was playing, his golden ball fell into the cage. So now we begin a second journey, where we're moving into a new level of understanding, and we're going to have to come back on that because I'm off to do an astrology reading, and this is probably a lot to think about. What I've already said. Did we lose some of ourself, our physical, emotional, mental, our 3 journeyings out into the forest of the world, the craziness of the unconscious? Are we not in touch with the unicorn and the doe with the 2 horns that are like in Carl Jung's book, The Mysterium, my words, conjunction of the sun and moon, or his alchemical studies? Have we lost our sense of the Atma Buddha, the king and queen, and have the little junior mind aligned itself yet? And we've lost men, and finally this unknown person in ourselves figures out to stop having desire and feelings and getting all emotionally attacked and attacking, and we drain the swamp for real and take a look at the world, and we find this really wild man, and we don't quite know what to do, but here he is, and our higher self goes, oh my God, could be a problem, and we have our passionate love and truth and our callings all caged up in iron, in the iron age of materialism and measure, number, and weight, rather than the measureless and the number one, or including the one in everything, the one in awe, and the one in awe of everything. And the weight is like light, wages of light and truth. And it weighs heavy too, heavy with qualities and virtues. And so we come to this place where we find out that the key that locks this up is with the queen. And the queen bee, the honeybee, is the inner wisdom that we can only get through time, or through an experience of eternity, or initiation, which is kind of a dying to where we were and digesting the experience and coming up with wisdom to go on. And why would we go on? For the sake of the world. Everybody's suffering and the world seems in trouble, and nothing lasts. And so we're now going into a story where the king had a son of 8 years, and he's playing with his golden ball. And so that's where we're leaving the story off, and we'll come back to it with the next continuation of Iron John, Iron Hans, and the eternal youth in us going forward without knowing quite what we're doing. Join me. This is Robert Thibodeau of Mayflower Bookshop, mayflowerbookshop.com, sharing with you the fairy tale Iron Hans, Iron John. John means Chan, John, Dzyan, like the stanzas of Dzyan or John, what Blavatsky wrote her Secret Doctrine on. Did you know that? And she has really big stories to talk about the word and Gospel of John, and the Johns and Chan and Dzyan that came earlier than the Gospel of John and continue into the future. So if you want to continue with me, we'll talk next storytelling, which will be coming soon.